About a week ago, my friend sent me this. It is the philosophical thought experiment Iceberg, containing the most mind-boggling thought experiments ever conceived. It was originally posted to the Iceberg chart subreddit by user Sweots. My friend asked me to explain it to him, so I thought we could go through this together, with the caveat that this video will, of course, slightly oversimplify basically everything. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. Level 1. On Level 1, we have the infinite monkey theorem. I'm sure that many of you have probably heard this. The general idea is to do with things with extremely small probability still happening on a long enough time frame or with a large enough set. So the infinite monkey theorem, as I think it was originally proposed, was this idea that if you left a monkey sat at a typewriter, hitting the keys randomly for an infinite number of time, it would eventually produce Hamlet, the play by Shakespeare. Or some people have proposed versions with the complete works of Shakespeare, or the Bible, or what have you. The idea is that eventually, given an infinite number of time, the monkey will produce every single text ever, and indeed every kind of concatenation of texts, I suppose. So I think this thought experiment is useful for getting it into someone's head when they're learning probability theory that with large enough sets of events, effectively, or long enough time frames, or however you want to put it, very unlikely events start to happen. Another good illustrative, more everyday example of this is that it's very unlikely for any individual person to win the lottery. But it's very likely that someone out of a lottery distribution system will win the lottery. Indeed, if it's a raffle system, then someone will win that raffle, even though it's unlikely for each individual person to do that. And I think that the infinite monkey on a typewriter thing is quite a useful analogy for that, just because obviously a monkey typing out Hamlet is so incredibly unlikely that this is a good illustrative example. I've sometimes seen this used to illustrate the idea that, okay, it seems like the universe is fine-tuned, but if you posited a kind of infinite string of universes, then a universe like ours would eventually come along, and that's a counter to the fine-tuning argument for God. I don't think it's a very good counter, but that is one place where I've seen the infinite monkey theorem used in a philosophically substantive context. But anyway, let's move on. On a similar note, next we have the Library of Babel. This is a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, who's an Argentinian author who's absolutely fantastic, by the way. Everyone should go check him out and check out this story in particular, because it really is brilliant. It was recommended to me by Brandon from the atheist philosophy channel Mindshift. I really enjoyed it. It was a great recommendation, so thank you so much. The setting for this story is a seemingly endless library where there are just almost innumerable 410-page books of randomly generated letters. So, you'll have one that will contain your life story, and you'll have another one that will contain Hamlet, and you'll have another one that will contain, well, a bit of the Brothers Karamazov. They won't be able to fit the whole thing in. But the point is that most of these books are going to be absolute nonsense, right? Because if you just randomly jumble up a bunch of letters, most of the time you're going to end up with nonsense. In some sense, you could use this to play with the concept of infinity, right? But actually, the interesting thing about the Library of Babel is there are going to be a finite number of unique books, right? Because there are only a finite number of ways that you can rearrange all of the letters of the alphabet into 410 pages. So, interestingly, although this is often seen as an infinite idea, it's not an infinite idea. There are only a finite number of ways that each book can be. And I think that's very interesting, because for me, the most fascinating part of the story isn't necessarily the books themselves or the concept of infinity, even though those are very good. Borges meat comes up a lot in his work. For me, it's how people react to the randomness of the library, right? Because it has no pre-existing structure. All of these books seem to be randomly scattered about the place. So you have kind of different cults and sects emerge that are each trying to extract some kind of meaning out of the random distribution of books, with these almost, the majority of these books are totally insensible, and how people react to that. I don't know if this is how Borges intended it, because I don't know enough about Borges, but this strikes me as one of the greatest absurdist short stories of all time. Because if you were to read this through a kind of absurdist lens, then The people in the library trying to make sense out of these randomly generated books are very similar to us, right? For an absurdist, we are living in an insensible universe, a universe that will never bring us the satisfaction and meaning that we desire. So any meaning that we read into the universe is just us reading it in, and we are just as absurd is probably the best word here, as these people in the Library of Babel in this Borges story attempting to puzzle out meaning out of the randomness of these books. And there's also another question, I suppose, which is, are the books properly stories, if that makes sense? There's no intention behind them. They've all been randomly generated. Is it possible for randomness to give birth to meaning? From one perspective, you could say that, okay, the books are randomly generated, but because they fit into a language, even if but just by chance, that means that they do contain meaning because they contain something that a human can understand and draw meaning from. So lots to think about. Very good story. Everyone should read it. And I could talk about it all day. Maybe I'll make a video on it at some point, but we should move on. Otherwise, this video is going to be several hours long. But before we move on, making head or tails of these thought experiments often requires critical thinking and logic skills, as well as some knowledge of physics, which is why I recommend you check out today's kind sponsor, Brilliant. We all know that studying subjects like maths or science or programming can be pretty difficult. These can get very abstract fast, which often present unique challenges for many students. But this is where Brilliant comes into play. They have courses on a huge variety of topics, from probability theory to programming with functions to learning the ins and outs of large language models or even classical mechanics. Each one is crafted by award-winning research teams. Plus, Brilliant's learning is all structured around completing activities so that you can learn by doing, which both improves retention and just keeps things interesting. It can also rescue you from social media doomscrolling, since with their app, you can complete lessons and exercises on the go wherever you are, rather than spending the afternoon wrestling with the thought experiment, why am I wasting my life on Twitter? If you want to improve your own critical thinking skills, then you should check out the logic courses on Brilliant, which will just let you see what logic is all about. And with even a little bit of formal logic, the world is surprisingly clearer. Or alternatively, you could check out their physics courses if some of the physics thought experiments today caught your eye. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/unsolicited advice, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description. Brilliant's also giving my viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. So please do check this out. But anyway, back to the video and back to the thought experiments. Okay, next up we have the trolley problem, and I'm sure that this one doesn't require much explaining. I'm sure that many of you have heard of this before, but for those of you who haven't, it's a scenario where you are standing by two train tracks with a lever, and the lever can switch between the train tracks. Now, on one track, there is one person tied to the train tracks, and on the other, there are five people tied to the train tracks. And the trolley, or train, or tram, or whatever transportational device you fancy, is heading towards the five people. So if you don't do anything, then it will kill five people, and you will have let five people die. But if you pull the lever, it will switch tracks, and it will hit the one person, but that's one person whose death you have directly caused. So the question is, do you pull the lever? And this isn't the original formulation, but it's now the most popular one, the one with the lever. People tend to think that pulling the lever is the right thing to do, killing the one to save the five. But then when you switch up the scenarios, people's intuitions tend to change. The very famous variation is one where you're shoving a kind of portly person, let's say, in front of the train that will slow it down. And that's still killing one person to save five, because you're stopping the train from hitting the five people, but it's much more visceral. It involves your own body. It's not as impersonal. And so people's intuitions tend to shift. And the question for moral psychologists and ethicists is, why is that? Right. Next up, we have Hilbert's Paradox of the Grand Hotel. And this is a very long and complex thought experiment, but I'm just going to give you the gist. So imagine a hotel, and it has an infinite number of rooms and is also fully occupied. So it's got an infinite number of rooms and an infinite number of guests. Can this hotel accommodate another guest. Intuitively, you want to say no, the hotel is full. If you had a finite number of rooms, if you had 40 rooms and 40 guests, then another guest shows up, you've kind of got to say, tough luck, the hotel's full. There is no room at the inn. We might have a stable out back, depending on if you're the son of God. What Hilbert is saying is that this property breaks down. This intuitive thing that happens when a hotel is full breaks down at the infinite level. So imagine that you've got a hotel with the rooms corresponding to the entire natural number line. So 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to approaching infinity, even though there won't be a room with the infinity symbol on it. I'm going to call it n just for ease of use. That's what that means. So you've got a hotel of size n with number of guests n. If another person shows up, what do you do? Well, one way of thinking about what you might do is that you take each person who's at room k and you move them to room k plus 1. So everyone in room 1 goes to room 2, everyone in room 2 goes to room 3, etc., etc., etc. And then this frees up room 1. You can put the new guest in room 1. And this kind of illustrates a really counterintuitive property of infinite sets, which is that size becomes very, very detached from our intuitions when we use finite numbers and stuff like that. So a good example to illustrate this is the set of even numbers, so 2, 4, 6, 8, all the way up to infinity, is the same size as the whole natural number set. So 2, 4, 6, 8, and on, is the same size as 1, 2, 3, 4, and on, and on, and on, and on. The reason this is because if you have infinite sets and you're trying to compare their sizes, you can't just count, because you'll be counting forever. That's a non-starter. So what do? Well, if we were trying to generalize the notion of counting. This is what mathematicians do. They love to generalize things. If you want to generalize the procedure of counting, you're effectively mapping something to a set of numbers. So if I count 5 things, I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, I'm setting up a function that maps each of those objects onto the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So size with infinite sets, and indeed with any sets, let's just stick with infinite for now. 2 infinite sets are the same size if you can set up a one-to-one function between the 2 of them. It's known as a bijective function. We'll just say one-to-one. So in the case of all of the even numbers and all of the natural numbers, you do have one of those functions. So if you multiply any natural number by 2, you'll get an even number. That's kind of what it means to be even. It means divisible by 2. And by the same token, if you take any even number and divide it by 2, you will get a natural number, whether that natural number is even or odd, right? So if I have 1, I times it by 2, I get 2. If I have 2, I divide it by 2 and I get 1. If I have 3, I times it by 2, I get 6. You can see where I'm going with this. This is a one-to-one function. So I can set up a one-to-one function between all of the natural numbers from 1 to infinity to all of the even numbers 2 to infinity, and vice versa. That's what it means for it to be a one-to-one function. This means that despite the fact that it seems like the even numbers would be half the size of all of the numbers, I mean, after all, they are a subset, a proper subset of all of the numbers, the natural numbers, these 2 sets are in fact the same size. And that's fascinating and brilliant. And again, it's just one of those weird properties that you get when you're playing with infinity. Infinity is going to come up an awful lot in these thought experiments because it's just a shortcut almost to coming up with mind-boggling situations that make your head hurt, of which this is just one. I could go on about the Hilbert Hotel thing. There's a brilliant mathematical proof method that was invented, or at least popularized, by a guy called Cantor, called diagonalization, which proves that there are situations where the hotel can't accommodate more guests. And it's all terribly exciting if you like set theory. Let's move on to the next one. Next up, we have the prisoner's dilemma. Again, I'm sure some of you will have heard of this, but to recap or to give a brief introduction, imagine that you and your accomplice are part of a criminal gang and you're hauled into the police station by a police officer and you're put in separate cells. So you're now isolated with this one police officer. Now, he gives you a deal. If you dob in, is that an expression outside the UK? I'm going to use it. Dob in your accomplice for this crime, you will be let free and they'll get sent to prison for 3 years. If they dob you in and you don't dob them in, then you'll get the 3 years and they'll go free. If you both choose to dob one another in, then you'll both go to prison for 2 years. And if neither of you choose to dob the other in, then you will both go to prison for 1 year because they can bring up some lesser charges or something like that. So you've got a decision matrix that looks roughly like this. If you both choose dob in, you both go to prison for 2 years. If you both choose not to dob in, then you both go to prison for 1 year. And if you choose to dob them in and they don't choose to dob you in, then you go free, they go to prison for 3 years. And if they dob you in and you don't dob them in, then you will go to prison for 3 years and they will go free. And you can't consult with them on this. And you know that they're being given the same deal. So interestingly, it always makes sense to dob the other person in this scenario, because think about it like this. If you choose to dob them in and they choose to dob you in, then you both go to prison for 2 years, which isn't ideal. But from a self-interested standpoint, that's better than if you choose not to dob them in and then they choose to dob you in, because you're going to prison for 3 years, right? Effectively, whatever they do, whether they choose to dob you in or choose not to dob you in, your most rational choice is to dob them in. In order for it to be rational for neither of you to dob the other one in, you would need some kind of non-egoistic factor at play. It gets more interesting when you iterate the game, right? So if you are told that not only are you going to have this prisoner's dilemma, but you're going to have, 100 more prisoner's dilemmas, then there's a much bigger incentive to not dob your accomplice in, because if you choose to dob them in this time, then they'll choose to dob you in next time. And over the long term, it's better for you all to go to prison for 1 year in each subsequent case than for you to go to prison for 2 years in each subsequent case. The reason this is important for the iterated version of the prisoner's dilemma is that this is often how social cooperation works, right? So imagine that you and me and 5 other people are taking part in some kind of infrastructure project that's going to benefit all of us. So we're all building a boat that we're all eventually going to use. In this case, in a non-iterated game, the most rational thing for you to do is going to be to try and minimize the effort you put in, right? Because you'll get to use the boat anyway, and this way you won't incur the cost of exerting yourself in building it. That's all well and good. But of course, in communities, more generally, we have to deal with one another after this. So the community will tend to develop some kind of slacker punishing method in order to combat this slacker tendency. And they can only do that if you're going to encounter one another again. And I think this does work out empirically. If you put people in a prisoner's dilemma-like session for one go, they will tend to choose the nefarious option. They'll tend to dob their accomplice in. But if you put them in successive prisoner dilemma style situations, normally involving small amounts of money, they will eventually learn to cooperate, because they will discover that cooperation over the long term is better than competition in the long term. And that's kind of interesting. It's one way that people have theorized that cooperative behavior can emerge from a set of purely self-interested individuals. So the iterated prisoner's dilemma for me is the most interesting version. But anyway, down to level 2. Level 2. Now, as we enter level 2 and the subsequent levels, I'm going to be looking at my notes a bit more because they get increasingly elaborate. This first one is very much like that. This is the Ross-Littlewood Paradox, which is absolutely fascinating. This also plays on the unintuitive properties of infinity. So, imagine this. You've got an empty vase and you've got a machine whose job it is to put balls in the vase and take balls out of the vase. Now, every time it commits this action, this one prescribed action, it puts 10 balls in the vase and it takes 1 ball out of the vase. So each time it's adding 9 balls intuitively. Now, let's imagine that this machine is going to do that task an infinite number of times in a finite space of time. So we can use a kind of Zeno-style setup for this. You can imagine that between 2 points of time, it does the first step halfway and then the second step a quarter way. And then, you know Zeno's paradoxes. The paradoxical question is, how many balls are left once the machine has finished this infinite number of operations? Now, the most intuitive answer, and the one that you want to gravitate towards, is that there'll be an infinite number of balls in the vase because you have been adding 9 each time. But looking at it differently, you could also argue that the vase is empty. So one way of thinking about this is to use that property of bijection or one-to-one mapping that we were talking about earlier when we were discussing sizes of infinity. See, I was kind of bearing the lead a bit here because I knew I would need it to explain the Ross-Littlewood paradox. There we showed that n over 2 was the same size as n, the natural numbers. But using very similar types of functions, you can show that the natural number line is the same size as 10 times the natural number line because you can set up a bijective function there as well. So from that perspective, the same number of balls have gone in as have come out. In which case, surely the vase is empty, right? So This is another example of how when you try to conceptualize infinity using like everyday objects, just nothing makes sense anymore. Another way that mathematicians have argued that the vase is empty is that you've got balls 1 through 10 being put in the vase and ball 1's being taken out of the vase. Well, the next round, ball 2 will be taken out of the vase, and then the next round, ball 3 will be taken out of the vase. So any ball that goes in the vase is eventually going to be taken out of the vase, which also suggests that the vase is going to be empty. Now, my personal intuition on this is that I just think that this is an example of why infinitely long tasks don't exist or possibly can't exist. I mean, this is probably one of the modern thought experiments that reminds me of Aristotle's old proofs that an actual infinity can't exist. So I know this one definitely does make my head hurt. But yes, that's the key question. Given that the machine has an infinite number of steps and it's putting in 10 balls in each step and taking away 1 ball at each step, how many balls are left at the end of the infinite number of steps? I have no idea. I suspect that the question might be underspecified, but let me know what you think. Next, we have the China brain experiment, which is an experiment or thought experiment, I should say, in the philosophy of mind. So, a little bit of background. One of the most popular positions in the philosophy of mind is called functionalism. And this argues that mental states are functional states, effectively. So, consciousness, or any other mental state, arises because of the different functions that neurons in our brain are undergoing. So it makes consciousness a sort of structural and functional property as opposed to being tied to particular brain matter or something like that. It's one of the strong arguments for functionalism is it seems like we don't want to rule out a priori that there might be such a thing as a silicon mind or an alien mind or anything like that. And this is one of the ways that philosophers of mind have tried to conceptualize how these non-grey matter minds might come about. And one thought experiment that has been posed, sometimes as a challenge and sometimes just as an illustration of this, is called the China brain experiment. So this was first proposed, well, actually, no, it wasn't first proposed by Ned Block, but that was where I first heard of it, and that is its most famous formulation. And he says, okay, take an incredibly populous country. So he chooses China, but in actual fact, to mirror the neural workings of a brain, you need far, far more people than that. So let's take an imaginary country that's just as populous as there are neurons in your average human brain. So if you gave every single person in that country a kind of little communications device such that they could relay signals to one another, and each of them chose to relay signals in exactly the same way that a human brain would that give rise to a mind? Would this mean that there was this populous country that now was a conscious thing that could think and have mental states in just the same way that we can? The functionalist has to say yes. And indeed, I think Daniel Dennett just does say yes. He's just like, yeah, man, like if that happens, then that would give rise to a mind. I just doubt that it will. I love this thought experiment. I think it's absolutely fascinating, partly because it raises the question of if there can be minds within minds. So it connects with something else that I find really fascinating in the philosophy of mind, which are split brain experiments. So I'm sure that many of you have heard of this. Basically, in the left and right hemispheres of the brain, to simplify things somewhat, there's a little communication center called the corpus callosum. And if you cut the corpus callosum, you sever those connections, you will end up with someone who has a kind of split brain. So their hand will do things without their conscious mind noticing. And it seems like one of the best ways to describe this person is that they have two distinct minds that are sort of inhabiting the same body. It's actually kind of a terrifying thought. Like, imagine if you were the mind that couldn't communicate. God, that sounds awful. Anyway, one way that philosophers have interpreted this, and indeed scientists have thought about this, is that effectively you might say that there are already two of you. They're just communicating very efficiently and thus giving rise to one mind. That is, there are two minds that are one mind in virtue of their structure. And it seems like the kind of initial implausibility of the China brain thought experiment or the incredibly populous country brain thought experiment is kind of shaken by this. It does seem like, even though it's unintuitive that this could give rise to a mind, there's not anything that a priori makes it totally implausible that there could be minds nested within other minds. And we kind of talk like this a little bit when it comes to kind of insects, right? I don't know if I would call an ant I don't know if I'd say it's a complex mind, but it feels like it has some kind of mind-ish state, even if it's of a very, very much lesser complexity than a human mental state or even a dog's mental state. But when ants are coordinating together, we talk about hive minds. And, you can argue that that's just metaphorical, but for the functionalist, it doesn't seem like it is. It seems like the hive mind as proper metaphysical mind is something that they might be committed to. I love this. I really like functionalism, and I'm totally prepared to bite the bullet on this one. I actually think that it would be so cool if you could have populous minds. I think that's brilliant. I love it. And yeah, sure, it's unintuitive, but it's cool enough that I don't mind it being unintuitive. That's probably not a very good philosophical defense, but it is a good psychological explanation as to why I am willing to just go with the China brain or the populous brain experiment. Next up, we have Buridan's ass. This thought experiment or paradox or whatever you want to call it has been used in a number of different ways, so I'm just going to give the way that I've seen it used most. I've mostly seen it as a way to satirize the strength of purely rational decision-making. Buridan's ass is a thought experiment whereby you imagine a donkey sat equidistant between a bale of hay and some water. And it's equally thirsty and equally hungry. And the idea is that it can't decide between whether it's going to go for the hay or go for the water, and so it just dies. I think that the immediate response to that is, of course, that you can survive a lot longer without food than without water. So a better reconstruction, I suppose, of this might be that it's between two bales of hay, and it's very, very hungry, but it doesn't prefer one bale of hay to the other. This has been used in a number of different ways, but I think that, for me, it really hammered home that sometimes it's just better to make a decision rather than sit there analyzing every single aspect to ensure that you are making the best decision possible. Sometimes no decision is absolutely the worst option. I talked about this a little bit in my video on self-awareness, and I do want to talk about it in more detail with the idea of overthinking. One of the things that people quite often comment under my videos, which is totally fair actually, is that I have a tendency to overthink things, which I absolutely do. And I do think that because philosophers tend to be fond of thinking, we do often have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to the idea of overthinking something and whether that could potentially be quite a bad or undesirable thing. So Buridan's ass is one way to illustrate this idea. Sometimes it is better to have made a decision than to make no decision in search of the perfect one. Though, of course, it has been used in many other ways. This is just one usage, but I do think that it's my favorite. Okay, next we have one of my favorites. This is Kavka's Toxin puzzle. I'm going to just tell this one as a bit of a story. So imagine that I am an eccentric billionaire. Wouldn't that be nice? And I came to you and I said, right, I'm going to give you £10 million or dollars or wherever you happen to be. I'm going to say pounds. £10 million if you drink this poison that will make you kind of really violently ill. It'll give you E. coli or something like that. And you might say yes or no to that. But then I reconsider. I say, no, hang on a sec. This is very cruel. I will give you £10 million if you can intend at midnight tonight that you're going to drink this poison tomorrow. So you don't have to drink the poison. You just have to intend to drink it at midnight. And I have some kind of magic brain scanner thing that will check that you really do intend to do it. And if you do intend to do it, then I will give you the £10 million. The question here is this possible? Is it possible for you to intend to drink the poison and then not drink the poison? We think about intention normally as a mental state which kind of makes a promise that you're going to do an action at a certain time. And it seems like you knowing that you don't actually have to drink the poison, you just have to intend to drink the poison, is going to interfere with your ability to intend to drink it, right? You're not going to be able to make that promise because you know, A, that you don't want to do it, and B, that you're not going to follow through with it, right? You don't have to. So I know this one actually hurts my head, which is why it's one of my favorites. Because do you just, if you want the £10 million, do you just put up and shut up and you just say, right, I'm just going to go through with it. I'm just going to intend to, and then I'm going to do it. But then you think, okay, but is that possible? Because the minute that midnight passes and you have intended to do it, you don't have to follow through with it. But then if you know that, does that interfere with your ability to intend to do it? It's absolutely fascinating. And oh my God, I'm giving myself a headache just thinking about it. But this is so cool, man. Thought experiments are the absolute best. It just makes your head hurt. But do let me know what you think. Do you think that it's possible to intend to do this, knowing that you don't have to follow through with it, and knowing that the £10 million will already be in your bank account if you have intended to do it? by the time it actually comes to doing it? Can you coherently think, I'm going to intend to do this, and then knowing that you won't have to follow through with it if you've successfully intended it? Or in order to successfully intend it, do you have to intend to do it whether or not you get the $10 million or £10 million? You just have to intend to do it no matter what. Oh, man, I don't know. This one boggles my mind, but it is fantastic. Right, you've probably heard of our next thought experiment, which is Schrödinger's cat. So I'm kind of surprised this one wasn't at the first level. Effectively, I'm sure you've heard this. A cat is locked in a box with a poison that will go off or burst when a random subatomic event happens, normally some kind of nuclear decay. The idea here is that under a kind of Copenhagen-style interpretation of quantum mechanics as applied to macro objects, in this case the cat is considered both dead and alive until you open the box to check whether it is dead or alive. And I think this was originally intended by Schrödinger to be a kind of critique of that interpretation. I think that at the very least it shows how wacky quantum mechanics would get if you applied it to macro objects. So it's kind of lucky that it doesn't apply. But, it does kind of generally illustrate this idea of a wave function collapsing. So I'm not surprised that it has ended up in the kind of interpretation of quantum mechanics pedagogy. I mean, I didn't really understand quantum mechanics myself. The maths is just absolutely mind-blowing. But I can see why this has become a kind of teaching aid, even if it was originally intended as satire. I don't understand quantum physics nearly well enough to say any more about this without majorly cocking it up, so I'm going to move on. Next up, we have Fermi's paradox, or I've sometimes heard it called the Fermi paradox, or just Fermi paradox. The basic intuition behind this is, if the universe is so big, why haven't we encountered aliens, man? Like, there seem to be planets on which aliens could form. The universe is so massive, there are so many planets and so many star systems and so many galaxies that it seems incredibly implausible that we are the only ones about. So where are they? Why haven't they made contact? And that's kind of the general thought behind it. I think when Fermi originally proposed it, he just said, where is everybody? Which is just a wonderfully succinct way of putting it. I like the Fermi paradox because I think that every answer is kind of disturbing. So one answer is just that, life is incredibly unlikely and we possibly are alone in the universe. And I don't know, that frightens me more than the existence of aliens. That frightens me far more than the prospect that aliens could come on the horizon tomorrow and enslave us all. Just like we're just alone. It's just nothing but unconscious darkness outside of our tiny little thin shell of an atmosphere. I don't know, that actually makes me feel kind of ill. But there are other explanations. So one is that aliens just don't want to make contact. Another is that they're hiding, which is kind of fun. It's almost sweet. Another quite existentially horrible one is the idea that any civilization that gets advanced enough to have faster than light travel or something like that, or incredibly advanced intergalactic capabilities, would just destroy itself before it ever got there. Eventually, I don't know, mimetic rivalry inherent in consciousness, beyond even humanity, just in consciousness itself, would cause them to wipe one another out, which is kind of a horrible thought. It kind of implies that it is just a necessary feature of conscious life that will just destroy one another or have conflicting tendencies. It kind of turns what I think most people see as a sort of slightly unfortunate aspect of quote-unquote human nature into a kind of synthetic a priori thing that every conscious being has to have. And that's horrible. I don't know if I like that. But, I think solutions to the Fermi paradox are kind of awful all the way down. Probably the most optimistic one is just that faster than light travel or intergalactic travel just is impossible. There just is no scenario where it could be achieved. All of the ideas about wormholes or information possibly traveling faster than the speed of light, maybe, we don't know, will just never come to fruition. And as a result, there are aliens, there's other life forms, so there's not the same kind of existential dread of us being alone in the universe. But at the same time, they're not going to say hello because they just can't get here, because no one can. I think how disturbing you find this particular thought experiment will heavily depend on how invested you are in the existence or non-existence of aliens. I'm weirdly quite emotionally invested. I hope that there are aliens. So this one kind of, I don't know, it chills me out a little bit, especially when I think of just humanity being alone in the universe. But, your mileage may vary. Right, next we have a classic thought experiment from philosophy. It is the Ship of Theseus. Again, I'm sure that some of you may have heard about this before. It's fundamentally a question of identity. So, we've got Theseus, and he's got a ship. And over time, Theseus repairs the ship. He takes one plank out and replaces it with another one. He might replace the mast, he replaces the sails. Eventually, he seems to have replaced everything. So there's kind of a new Ship of Theseus. And the question is, at what point did this new Ship of Theseus emerge? So one way to illustrate this is to say that, okay, Theseus has got this ship, and then he takes all of the old parts that he'd replaced with other parts, and he assembles them back in to another Ship of Theseus. And he's got two ships in front of him. Which one is the original ship? I think people tend to think about this kind of question of identity as somewhat trivial when it's applied to ships, but it could just as easily apply to people. You share almost nothing with who you were as a toddler, and you certainly share basically nothing with who you were as a fetus. So, you have very different memories. You've got a very different personality from when you're a toddler. I hope. I think we all do. And so, to what extent does it make sense to say that you are the same person? You kind of inhabited a sort of continuously overlapping physical form. But if I was to just, take you now and take toddler you would be so fundamentally different people. It would be very strange to talk about you as the same person. And again, this can seem like a kind of idle exercise until you think about things like moral responsibility. Say I commit a crime now. I go out and rob a shop. In 35 years' time, I'm caught. I would go to prison for that, especially in the UK because there's no statute of limitations on things. Given that that's the case, does it seem right? Because 35 years on, I'm an entirely different person from who I am now. Chances are I'm unlikely to rob shops again. But also, it just seems like you're taking someone who didn't do the crime and punishing them. And that's fascinating, partly because it kind of chimes relatively well with some of the stuff that we say in our everyday lives. When we're asking for forgiveness or something like that. I'll give you an example. So I was picked on when I was at primary school. I know, I bet that's really hard to believe. And somebody that picked on me at primary school came up to me a few years ago and, apologized, which was really sweet. And they sort of said, I'm a different person now. And I was like, yeah, of course you are, right? You're 20 now and you were 8 when you were bullying me. So really, on the whole, it doesn't seem, that seems like an obvious statement. And it was very hard to sort of be mad at them, right? Because they're an entirely different I kind of moved on, it had been 12 years. But also, it seemed very strange to hold them in the present accountable or responsible for actions that seem like they're intuitively done by somebody who is not in any way equivalent to them. There have been so many changes that they've gone through that it seems like they are an entirely different person. Their statement, I'm a different person now, seems intuitively correct. So what do we do? It's all well and good. I can say that made it far easier to say, oh yeah, don't worry about it, man. But what do we do in cases of crime? It's an open question. Genuinely, it's an open question. Do we have a strong enough idea of identity that we can say that they were the same person, say they committed a crime at 20 and they're getting caught for it at 60? Can we say that they are the same person? Or are we just imprisoning somebody who didn't commit the crime because they're now so different that it doesn't make sense to talk about them as the same person? I don't know. I think that my favorite solution to this is probably Derek Parfit's. Derek Parfit just kind of bites the bullet and says, who you are is kind of a continuous thing. You're not equivalent to you 20 years ago. At the same time, you're not fully equivalent to you a second ago. We think about personal identity as this kind of stripped on or off thing. I am either equal to me 10 minutes ago or I'm not. And Parfit says, yeah, okay, in a sense you're not equal to them, but you're so similar that it makes sense to treat you as equivalent to them. But give it 10 years, that assumption might not hold anymore. You can tell that Parfit's almost certainly been influenced by some kind of Buddhist thought here. And I don't know, that seems to me to be the most convincing answer. My moral intuitions, I suppose, are that, when confronted with this dilemma in quite a minor form in my own life, I found that I didn't hold the person responsible because I held that they were, in a real substantive sense, a different person. But I suspect that I might be kind of idiosyncratic there. Certainly, I'd probably be much angrier about it if it was a much more significant harm that had been inflicted on me. So I don't know. Again, this is one where I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say about it. So please do leave a comment. Right, next up we have Newcomb's paradox. Now, I'm going to read basically directly from my notes here because it's quite a difficult one to keep track of, and I will royally cock it up if I try and do it off the top of my head. Here is the thought experiment. You have two boxes in front of you, and a superintelligent AI has control over what's going to be in those boxes. The first box is transparent, and it always contains £1,000. The second box is not transparent, you can't see through it, and you know that it's either empty or contains £1,000,000. You are presented with a choice. Do you take both boxes, or do you just take the opaque one, the one that isn't transparent? Here's the catch. The superintelligent AI can near perfectly predict your every move, and it will have only placed the £1,000,000 in the opaque box if it predicted that you would choose to only take the opaque box. So, the paradox here is that it basically seems like there are two rational considerations pulling you in very different directions. On the one hand, it seems like it's rational to take both boxes because the contents of the boxes are already there at the time you're making the decision, and they're not going to change now, right? So if you choose to take both boxes, then you'll get the contents of the opaque box as well as the transparent one, and the contents of those boxes are always going to be strictly larger than just taking the opaque one. So it just seems like a no-brainer, right? Choosing the opaque box and the transparent box always gives you more. But on the other hand, this hypothetical superintelligent AI will have only put the £1,000,000 in the opaque box if it thinks that you'll only pick the opaque box. But then, if that's the logic on which you're basing your decision, then you're sort of implying a kind of backwards causation, right? You are saying that your decision now to only take the opaque box is causing the AI in the past to only place the £1,000,000 in that opaque box, which kind of seems weird, right? It seems like future events can't cause past events. But on the other hand, that does kind of seem like it's implying backward causation, because if you didn't think that, you would just take two boxes, because once you're there, the contents of both boxes are always going to be strictly larger than the contents of just the opaque box. So yeah, there are two rationally compelling reasons to choose just the opaque box or choose the transparent and the opaque box, pulling you in two different directions here. One of my friends is currently working on this at the moment, and he occasionally talks to me about this, and it always makes my head hurt. I love it. He's just one of those people that's kind of irritatingly clever. He came top of his year at Cambridge and is also like a FIDE chess master. He's really cool though, really nice guy. But anyway, that's kind of the long and short of Newcomb's paradox. Most philosophers, no, not most, it's like a plurality. I looked it up earlier, it was like 39%. It's like a slim plurality of philosophers choose to take both boxes. But there is a significant number of people that choose to take just the opaque box. I'm so team opaque box. I don't quite know why. Maybe I do just affirm backwards causation. But for me, when I'm kind of running this through in my naive thought process that hasn't been sort of trained by years and years of considering Newcomb's paradox, what I tend to think is that, okay, this superintelligent AI can run a simulation of my decision-making process. And if that simulation is accurate, then it's going to predict whatever I decide. So then the only way to get it to predict that I will choose the opaque box is actually committing to only choosing the opaque box now and following through with it. It's a little bit similar to Kavka's paradox, you know, that one that we were talking about earlier. And it trades on a similar tension. At the time of making the decision, it seems like the rational option, once the opaque and transparent box's contents are fixed, then the rational option seems like it's going to be to take both of them. But since there's this kind of super intelligent thing predicting what you're going to do, it seems like then there's a consideration about picking something that seems like it's irrational. In this case, actually picking just the opaque box or following through and choosing to drink the poison. But because the whole outcome of the situation hinges on a super intelligent being predicting what you're going to do, it seems like it's almost, you've got a rational reason to pick something that seems like it's irrational, and it's just mind-boggling. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that similarity between Newcomb's paradox and Kavka's paradox. They both rely on you, in the past, choosing to do something that seems like it's going to be irrational when it comes to the actual time to make the decision. But nonetheless, because there is a separate third party running a completely accurate simulation of your decision-making process, that you're going to have to rationally pre-commit to doing an irrational thing in the moment. God, my head hurts. But yeah, Newcomb's paradox is brilliant, and some of the literature on it is very interesting, but it is mind-boggling. I highly recommend looking it up and having arguments with your friends about it, because it does seem like intuitions genuinely are split on what to do. And what's fascinating is that people tend to think that their intuition is like unquestionably correct. Like when I first came across this paradox, I was like, yeah, I'm team opaque box. And like I didn't see why anyone wouldn't be team opaque box until somebody explained to me that, of course, there is in the present a very good rational reason for taking both boxes. Right, down to level 3. Level 3. Our first level 3 thought experiment is the brain in a vat thought experiment. I think this is almost always misunderstood, really. It was put forward by Hilary Putnam, who was a 20th century analytic philosopher and also just a really cool thinker. Hilary Putnam's fantastic. I read one of his books when I was like 18 called Representation and Reality. And it was fantastic. It was one of the things that like really cemented that I was going to apply for philosophy at uni. Sorry, I must have been 17 then. Anyway, I read it when I was a teenager. It was fantastic. I didn't understand any of it. I would highly recommend it too. The brain in a vat thought experiment is almost always presented as if it's like equivalent to the simulation hypothesis, right? The idea is that, oh, we could all be brains in vats simulating the outside world and we'd never realize it. But Hilary Putnam is actually putting this forward as an anti-skeptical argument. He's saying that it actually doesn't make sense to say that you're a brain in a vat. And he has quite a technical version of this argument, so I'm going to like strip it of all technicality and give a kind of slightly bastardized variant on it that I think is much easier to understand. Imagine that you are a brain in a vat in some sense. So your entire reality is simulated. Well, then your words, things like brain and vat and even the word true, right? These all only have definitions inside the simulation because you've never stepped outside of the simulation to have any other words, right? All of your words could only refer to things inside the simulation. As a result, when you say, I am a brain in a vat, that statement has to be false. Or when I say, I am a brain in a vat, that statement has to be false because if I use the phrase brain in a vat, I could only ever be referring to intra-simulation brains in vats, even under the assumption that I was in a simulation. So the idea here is that Putnam is pulling apart the consequence of radical skeptical theories like the evil demon hypothesis or the simulation hypothesis or anything like that. He is pulling apart the connection between being in one of those and the idea that all of our beliefs are false. Hilary Putnam is sort of saying, well, even if you are a brain in a vat, that doesn't mean that all your beliefs are false because all of your object words and even your definition of truth only applies within the simulation. His full argument actually goes one step further than this and says that if you were a brain in a vat, you couldn't even express that thought, right? How would I get at the world outside of the simulation using all of my intra-simulation language? It just doesn't make any sense. Or at least that's Putnam's point. I kind of think the specifics of his argument, you could challenge different premises, right? You could argue, okay, this rests on like a causal theory of reference, and you could reject a causal theory of reference. You know, you can kind of attack the particulars of this argument. What I like about Putnam's brain in a vat argument, it kind of gets at the intuition that even if I did live in a simulation, it doesn't seem like very much would hang on that. It seems like as long as I couldn't leave the simulation, I would just go about my day-to-day life. Everything that matters to me is in the simulation. All the people I love are. Everything that I do is within the simulation. All of my significance is within the simulation. And I say all of my definitions of truth and falsity and justification are all within the simulation. So there's a sense in which I'm in a simulation, but there's also a sense in which that doesn't seem to matter. I'm certainly not in a simulation by my own intra-simulation definition of simulation, which is kind of the point that Putnam's getting at. On the flip side, I can see why people kind of think this is a bit fishy. It sounds like playing with language. I don't think it is playing with language. I think that this is a linguistic stroke logico-linguistic way of explicating a very intuitive philosophical point, which is that if you're in a simulation, it doesn't seem like it matters. However, I do also think that there are holes in this as an anti-skeptical argument. One interesting one is, okay, imagine that I wasn't in a simulation until yesterday when someone hit me over the head and then took out my brain and put it in a vat and then simulated the world as it was before I'd been knocked over the head and had my brain removed. Well, in that case, there's not the same kind of, you can't construct the same kind of argument because all of my words were in the real world and now they're not. But also it doesn't have the same kind of coherence with our kind of existential fears, right? I can no longer say that everything that matters to me is in the simulation, because no, everything that matters to me is outside the simulation, and I've only just recently gone into the simulation. I know, maybe my conclusion from the whole chain of argument here is that it's much more existentially terrifying to have once been in the real world and then been placed in a simulation than it is to have never been in the real world and to have always existed in a simulation. Okay, next up we have determinism. I'm not going to spend too long on this, partly because I've got whole videos on it, but also because this is a philosophy channel, so you probably have heard of determinism before. I think the best kind of thought experiment version of determinism is Laplace's demon, which is the idea that if there was a demon who knew everything about the past and everything about the present, like every single atom and its position and every single thing, every single fact in the universe, could it then predict exactly the next moment and the moment after that? And could it then predict the entire future of the universe? And in theory, the entire past of the universe, maybe. If so, then determinism is true. That's one way of kind of dramatizing determinism. If you know everything about the present, could you predict the future with absolute certainty? This has different layers as a thesis. Cosmic style determinism, where you just think that everything is determined, has come under some fire from results in quantum physics, which suggests that there is some genuine uncertainty as to what's going to happen from one moment to the next because of the stochastic nature of quantum equations. Though, of course, there is the additional moving part there of how you interpret quantum mechanics and how you cash it out metaphysically. The other consequence of determinism as a metaphysical thesis that people care about is the idea that it disproves the existence of free will, right? If all our actions are determined, then we don't freely choose what we do. We couldn't help but have done otherwise. And this is still a debate in philosophy. Whether it's true for a start, but also whether, if it is true, there aren't other versions of free will that recapture quite a lot of what we want from free will. So, for instance, I'm kind of broadly compatibilist, but compatibilism is the idea that you can salvage some notion of free will even in a deterministic universe. One day I'll make a full video on the details of why I think there are versions of compatibilism that are definitely worth listening to. But for now, we'll move on to the next one, because you've all heard me talk about determinism before, and I'm sure you're all sick of it. Right, next up we have the Mandela Effect. This is sort of a description for mass misremembering. It's called the Mandela Effect because a lot of people remembered that Mandela died in prison in the 80s, but he didn't. He died in 2013. And as a result, that was a strangely common way of misremembering history. And there are loads of versions of these. I can't go through them all. One is like a kids program that was called the Berenstain Bears. But people remember it as the Berenstain Bears and stuff like that. And, oftentimes I see the kind of disturbing part of this thought experiment be the idea that these could have drifted in from other realities or other universes, like facts from those universes or observations from those universes could have leaked through into ours. But I think the far more disturbing conclusion is just that our memories distort things every time we call them to mind, and that actually these mass distortion events are perfectly and horribly possible, which then does give you a kind of latent skepticism about everything you've ever remembered. I remember looking into the kind of distortive effects of memories, especially kind of emotionally tinged memories, and how, they can seem just as real as when the event happened, but nonetheless you are misremembering it. And that's terrifying to me, because memories are really important. Imagine that somebody wiped all of your memories. It would feel like you were an entirely different person. It seems like our memories are such a core part of who we are. One of the really disturbing things, I think, in Orwell's 1984 is that the state kind of prevents the development of memory, both individual memory and collective memory. And that's one of the most existentially terrifying themes in the novel. And so the Mandela Effect, aside from any kind of concerns about alternative universes drifting into ours, it just kind of seems like it potentially undermines our faith in our own memories. Of course, not all of them, but it opens the door for that kind of reasoning. And I think that there is a reasonable amount of empirical evidence that our memories are much more fallible than we often consider. Maybe you don't find that scary. I find that absolutely scary. And as a result, this Mandela Effect one, though it kind of is something that gets seen on listicles and stuff, I don't think we often appreciate the true existential horror of the Mandela Effect. Next, we have another thought experiment by Putnam, and this one is called Twin Earth, and this is about externalism regarding the reference of our words. It's all very exciting. Well, it's exciting to me. How do you think your words refer to things? A really intuitive answer is to say that they refer by internal description. So my word picks out this book in front of me because I have a little description for it in my head. I know it's blue. I know it's called Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis and Other Stories. I know that the blurb says one of the few great and perfect works of poetic imagination written during the 20th century. So that's a very intuitive way to think about reference. Reference is in some way in our heads. My words pick out what I intend them to pick out. This is internalism about reference. Now, Putnam disagrees with internalism about reference. He is an externalist, and he illustrates this with a thought experiment, arguing against internalism. So, imagine that there is a theoretical twin Earth with exactly the same people in it, exactly the same stuff. Everything is exactly the same, apart from one crucial difference. And that is that whereas the chemical composition of water on our world is H2O, there it is XYZ, where XYZ are new chemicals. There, if my twin on twin Earth had the thought, there is water in my glass, he would be having the exact same mental state that I have when I think that there's water in my glass, because he's exactly the same as me in all ways, including mental ways. However, the referent of his term water would pick out XYZ, whereas mine would pick out H2O. So the mental content's exactly the same, but the reference is different. And thus, it cannot be that reference is just in the head, or as Putnam put it, meaning just ain't in the head. There are many different responses to this. My personal favorite is to say something like, okay, yeah, the thing that my word picks out isn't entirely up to me, but when I'm intending to pick something out, I am kind of defining a function that then picks out things in the world. So, both me and my twin on twin Earth will be thinking something like, the clear, drinkable water that sustains my life is filling the glass in front of me. And in my world, that will pick out H2O, and on twin Earth, that will pick out XYZ. And this does say that, okay, referent is partly a matter of non-mind stuff, but there's still a heavy amount of mind involvement, which I think is important. So that's my way of kind of responding to and or accepting the consequences of this thought experiment. I know, I like this. I like thinking about language, so I'm a bit biased towards this. Also, Putnam has managed to get 2 slots in this thought experiment, which is pretty impressive, I think. He's just got a way with thought experiments. But anyway, let's move on. Right, next up we have Flatland. Flatland was originally a satirical novel from the Victorian period that attacked a whole bunch of stuff, including social structures and ideas of knowledge and all sorts. But how it's been used in philosophy is ever so slightly different. The kind of premise of Flatland is that you've got these beings that live in a 2D world. So in the novel, the main character is a square, and I think there are gender divides. So I think women are lines and men are polygons. But this is largely used today in kind of introductory philosophy of physics textbooks to get an intuition as to what a higher dimensional space might be conceptualized as, if that makes sense. So the idea as it's used is that just as we can imagine a set of 2-dimensional beings in 2-dimensional space for which 3D space is just like an unfathomable thing. Like they don't even know how to conceptualize it because they've never experienced it. And even at one point, I think, in the book, the shape square kind of goes to a 1-dimensional world and tries to convince them of the existence of 2 dimensions, and they're just not having it, which of course they wouldn't, right? They have no empirical evidence for this and no way of conceptualizing it. But of course, now, through physical theories like general relativity, we do have a sense of higher dimensional space. General relativity theory, if I understand or remember correctly, is based on a kind of 4-dimensional semi-Riemannian manifold. So one way of getting an intuitive gloss on this is to think, okay, yeah, well, just as we can imagine a 2D space embedded in 3D space, you could think of a piece of paper, which is kind of a 2-dimensional plane embedded in the 3D space of our reality, so too, we are a 3-dimensional space embedded within a 4-dimensional higher space. So yeah, I think that's probably how the Flatland thought experiment is mainly used today. That was how it was used in my undergrad. And I know, it's a fun idea. Of course, you could just iterate the thought experiment again and say, well, what if there are 4-dimensional creatures embedded in 5-dimensional space and stuff like that? And it can get kind of fun. So yes, on balance, I think this is a very fun thought experiment that even has a handy pedagogical usage. Next up, we have the floating man thought experiment. So this was a thought experiment by Ibn Sina, possibly the greatest Islamic philosopher of all time. I don't know if you've read any Ibn Sina, but he's like, I suppose one way of like conceptualizing it, if you're not into Islamic philosophy at all, and I don't know that much about it, but like I know a bit of Ibn Sina and a bit of Ibn Rushd, would be he's like St. Thomas Aquinas in Islam, I suppose, would be one way of having a reference point. He's like an absolute legend and truly a genius, a giant of philosophy who is, I think, really underappreciated. But anyway, one of his thought experiments is this floating man thought experiment, which was part of how he wanted to give a kind of conceptual proof or conceptual argument for the separability of the mind and body, as part of a general idea of having a philosophical defense of the immortality of the soul. The general idea is that a man is kind of brought into existence, floating in the sky with no access to his senses. So he doesn't have any kind of external sense data. He's just working on pure reflection. And Ibn Sina's point is that it seems like this man would still be aware of himself as a self. So he's accessing something by pure reflection, even though he doesn't have any kind of external input telling him that it exists. And so Ibn Sina suggests the self can be known by pure reflection without kind of empirical evidence. And since everything physical is learnt by empirical evidence, this gives at least some kind of prima facie case for the non-physicality and the separability of the soul. That's a very kind of simplified gloss of the argument. It's very similar to Descartes' argument for dualism, where he talks about the conceivability of the separation of the mind from the body. And yeah, I don't know if this is where Descartes got it, or if they're just independently developed arguments. I mean, they both bear kind of a similarity to Socrates' argument about the immortality of the soul in Plato's dialogues. There's a long tradition of these sorts of arguments being used in kind of dualist philosophical circles. One way you could respond to this argument is by saying something like, yes, it seems like the soul is, or the mind is, conceptually separable from the body, but that's just because we don't know enough about our concept of the mind, right? So one way of framing this might be, you might appeal to something like the work of Gottlob Frege. So one of Frege's observations is that there are things that are inseparable or even identical that we don't realize are identical until we go about some further investigation. So his example is Hesperus and Phosphorus, or it's the morning star and the evening star. I don't know which way around they are. But his point is, these were both eventually discovered to be Venus, but at the time, people didn't know that. And so, conceptually, they could have made an argument that Hesperus and Phosphorus were conceptually separable and thus distinct things. And one of Frege's points, as well as introducing the notion of sense, which is really cool and we don't have time to go into it, is that you can't prove inseparability by purely conceptual argument, is kind of one of the corollaries of Frege's point. And this is incredibly cool and incredibly useful. You can use it to respond to the open question argument by G.E. Moore about definability of the good in ethics. And this kind of quite simple insight has a huge range of applications. And it's amazing that it was kind of, only put with such clarity and precision by Frege in the 19th century. Oh man, Frege is just a kind of, a once-in-a-century genius. Anyway, that would be one way you could respond to Ibn Sina's argument. Our next thought experiment is the cow in the field. This one might require a bit of background. Essentially, for basically all of philosophical history since Plato, we've had a certain idea of what constitutes knowledge called the justified true belief model. It's pretty intuitive, right? We know something when we have a belief about something. That belief is true, and we're justified in holding that belief. So it's not enough to have a true belief, you must also have a good justification for that belief. This is what's called a Gettier case, which is a counterexample to the justified true belief model, whereby someone has a justified true belief, but it feels like it's come about by chance in some way. These were formulated by Edmund Gettier, who published like a 2-page paper on this, and it's still, I think, the most read paper from the philosophical journal Analysis, which is just an amazing achievement to have because he apparently just rattled it off in an afternoon or something. It was a very brief process. He just kind of came across this and was like, oh my God, I've disproven one of the most incredibly stable theories in all philosophy. This is one such case. It's not from his original paper, but it's about. So imagine that there is a farmer walking through a field. He spots a smudge of kind of white and dark spots on the horizon. He's like, that my cow is in that field. His thought is, my cow is in that field. That's very important. Unbeknownst to him, that's actually not his cow. That's just a kind of smudge of newspaper that's blowing in the wind, a very big bit of newspaper, let's say, blowing in the wind at the edge of his field. However, also unbeknownst to him, his cow, which is genuinely in that field, is sat behind a tree somewhere. So, in this case, he has a justified true belief that the cow is in the field, but nonetheless, it seems like in some sense this doesn't quite count as knowledge because the way he's come about to have the belief seems disconnected from the truth of the statement. So it's not so much a paradox or anything like that. It's meant to be a counterexample to the JTB model of knowledge, and various people have tried to deal with this in different ways. One way to do it is to say that, okay, it seems like he's justified, but he's not really justified because there is a false belief in his deduction of the belief that there is a cow in the field, right? He's relying on the idea that this smudgy black and white thing in the distance is his cow, and that's false. So that's one way of responding to it. But there are many different ways of responding to it. Also, some people just alter their definition of knowledge. But yes, a fascinating thought experiment from what I think is a deeply underrated area of philosophy in popular discourse. Next up, we have the twin paradox. This isn't actually a paradox in the traditional sense, but it is an interesting consequence of, I think, special relativity theory, and as a result, relativity theory in general, no pun intended. Essentially, this is a counterintuitive consequence of those theories, those physical theories, because in both special and general relativity theory, the speed of light is a constant, no matter how fast you're traveling. So whether you're traveling at 300,000 kilometers per hour or 5 kilometers per hour, the speed of light, a kind of light beam in a vacuum, will always look the same to you. As my notes say, whatever speed you're moving, the speed of light always has to look the same as it would to someone standing still. But since the speed of light is constant, something else has to shift in order to make the equations of relativity theory balance when you're moving at speed. And what shifts is the amount of time passed from that observer's perspective. So, say you have two twins, and one remains on Earth, and another accelerates near the speed of light, say 99% of the speed of light, and then turns around and goes back to Earth at that same speed. So they've been traveling near the speed of light this whole time. And say they've been doing this for like 10 years. That might have only been 10 years past for them, but when they get back to Earth, they will have found that 50 to 100 years will have passed for all the people remaining down on the Earth. I don't know the exact maths, but the point is a lot longer would have passed for the people remaining on Earth than would have done for this particular traveler. So why is this worth talking about? Well, because in Newtonian mechanics, and indeed in our everyday life, when we're just talking about the world of middle-sized objects, as philosophers have started to call the aspect of the world where Newtonian mechanics basically approximates, we treat time as if it is a constant. You know, we have a clock. It ticks by at 1 second per second, and every clock in the world ticks at roughly the same rate. This is a good way to demonstrate that that way of viewing time no longer works under general relativity and special relativity theory. In fact, time is no longer a strict constant. It can vary depending on other things that you're changing in the equation. In this case, how fast someone is accelerating or traveling. This is called time dilation, and it is just one of the cool, unintuitive consequences of relativity theory. And I think that people view it as a paradox because it just clashes with our everyday intuitions and our experiences in the world. But it's not a paradox. It is perfectly consistent with the rules of relativity theory, and I think it's been empirically proven to be true. So we've even verified it. It's one of those wonderful situations where some deeply unintuitive mathematics has then gone on to be empirically shown to be true in the actual physical world we inhabit, which is just a lot of fun. Okay, next on the iceberg, we have Boltzmann Brains. What is a Boltzmann brain, first of all, just as an object? Effectively, a Boltzmann brain is a randomly occurring brain that has a bunch of false memories about the world around it. It's like an isolated brain out in space or out in some state that nonetheless thinks that it's experiencing our reality, let's say, or just a stable reality around it. So, how do we get to the existence of these Boltzmann brains, or the possible existence of these Boltzmann brains? The fundamental idea to bear in mind here is infinite time, right? We've been dealing with infinite time a fair amount in this video, and this is just another deeply unintuitive consequence of it. Basically, the second law of thermodynamics states that everything tends towards what are called high entropy states, which are basically states of low order. The fun kind of intuitive reason for why this is that a high entropy state can come about in lots and lots of different ways, whereas a low entropy state can only come about in a few ways. So, one intuitive example of this might be my bookshelf, right? That bookshelf is kind of an ordered object. If I were to instead say that, the bookshelf was just disassembled in bits of wood on the floor, that would be intuitively a lower entropy or a higher entropy arrangement of the bits of wood. Because effectively, there's only kind of a few ways in which you could arrange those bits of wood to be the bookshelf, whereas there are loads of ways you could arrange it to be a pile of wood on the floor, right? Because, the conditions just aren't as strict. How do we get from the second law of thermodynamics to Boltzmann brains? Effectively, Ludwig Boltzmann was a 19th century physicist, and he argued that we could explain the relatively low entropy state of our kind of world and galaxy by appealing to the idea that all of existence could be infinitely old. It could have existed for an infinite amount of time. That would be one way whereby you would have low entropy states just coming about by chance, because anything with a low probability will happen eventually if you give it a long enough time. And if you've got an infinite amount of time, then these things will happen infinitely. You'll get an infinite amount of low probability events occurring. But we immediately have a bit of a problem, because it seems like a spontaneously occurring Boltzmann brain with lots of fake memories and the idea that it's experiencing a true reality, that's a significantly less complex event than the universe ordering itself in the way that it has, or even let's take our solar system ordering itself the way that it has in this kind of low entropy seeming way. Given that, it seems like the majority of brains that are formed by chance over this infinitely long period of time are going to be Boltzmann brains. And if that's the case, then because by far the majority of existing consciousnesses will be Boltzmann brains with fake memories, we should conclude that we ourselves are Boltzmann brains. So yes, if Boltzmann is right, then it is rational in this thought experiment, I suppose. Boltzmann probably didn't actually believe this. He's posing a thought experiment. If Boltzmann's thought experiment holds and the universe does exist for an infinitely long period of time, stretching into both the past and the future, then it is rational to conclude that you are a Boltzmann brain rather than a real person experiencing the universe. Quite a mind-boggling thought experiment, and I'm still not entirely sure that I've got my head around it. But it's a lot of fun, and it does leave you with a key question. Are you a Boltzmann brain? Level 4. Okay, first on the level 4 section of our iceberg is multiverse theory. Multiverse theory obviously comes in many, many forms, and since the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is a bit further down, I'm not going to talk about that here. But in its broadest possible sense, multiverse theory is the idea that there do exist parallel universes running parallel to ours, that there are alternative realities that actually exist that in some sense are just as real as our own. One of the more fun versions of this in philosophy is the concrete modal realism of someone like David Lewis. David Lewis argues that, or he theorizes and does give some arguments for it, that every possibility does exist in a concrete universe just like our own, but we call this universe the real universe because it's the one that we happen to be at. He turns real into a kind of indexical term. But one of the quirks of Lewis's idea of possible worlds, of concrete modal realism, is that he doesn't think that these universes can interact with ours or with each other. So in some ways, it's not the version of parallel universes or multiverses that you might have seen in science fiction. But then also there are other people that have slightly different conceptions of different parallel universes. I think one of my favorites is, I can't remember the guy's name, but he postulated that every mathematical possibility is instantiated in some universe. And when you put all these together, you get like the world of mathematics in a great omniverse, which is a lot of fun. I don't really see any reason to believe it exists, but I love a cool idea. I think one of the interesting questions about multiverse theories is, what are the limitations that you place on the multiverse? So is it just a series of universes with our physical laws, but they have different kind of material objects in them or different arrangements of material objects? Is it that we stretch it so that even universes with different laws of physics can exist? Do we stretch it even further and say that universes with different logical laws can exist? There's a universe somewhere where the law of non-contradiction is false. I think this connects a little bit about a lot of the thoughts we've been having about infinity from earlier in the video. If there are a huge number of parallel universes, then very strange events can occur. And do we want to start placing limits on what we consider to be even candidates for parallel universes? It's food for thought. Again, different people argue for multiverses in different ways, and oftentimes they will argue that certain things are fixed, like the laws of physics are fixed. And lots of people argue that at the very least the laws of logic are fixed. But I think that the question of the limits of the multiverse strikes me as quite an interesting one, and I'd like to look into it further. Next up, we have Swampman. This is a philosophical thought experiment from Donald Davidson, who's probably best known for his theories about the indeterminacy of language, but this is also a thought experiment he's become pretty well known for. The rough thought experiment goes a bit like this. Imagine one day that you are walking through a swamp when lightning suddenly hits you and you explode into a million pieces. But simultaneously, as this is happening, maybe with the power generated by the lightning strike, there emerges another figure from the swamp who is physically and mentally identical to you. They have all the same thoughts and feelings. But the question is, can the Swampman have thoughts and language about the world in the same way that we could, since it has, in effect, never really interacted with any of the things that it's going to talk about? When we see a dog, and we say dog, there is a causal history, a causal chain that runs from the word that we've been using, dog, all the way back to when we were little and somebody pointed at a dog and said dog. There's a causal connection there that is missing in the Swampman. So Davidson asks us whether the Swampman, devoid of any of this history, can use language meaningfully in the same way that we can. Davidson certainly says no, but this is very much an open question, and it ties into that internalist-externalist debate that we touched upon when we were looking at Hilary Putnam's twin Earth experiments. But I think potentially a more fascinating version of this idea would be just to ask a slightly different question. So you've also gone to the swamp and you've been not eviscerated, evaporated, disintegrated by the lightning. And this clone has also come out with all of your memories and you're physically and mentally identical. Here's a question. Say this was going to happen in advance and you knew it. So I was going to say, okay, you're going to go out into this swamp and you're going to get hit by lightning. You might be understandably kind of scared. Now imagine if I said, you're going to go out into that swamp and you're going to be hit by lightning, and an identical clone at the exact same moment is going to be made anew out of different materials and will think and feel that it is you. Would that make you less scared? I think that's a fascinating question, partly because it gets me onto kind of a bugbear of mine. In sci-fi films, I think people are just far too comfortable using teleporters. I understand that they've probably been normalized in the universe that they exist in, but most of them seem to work by disintegrating you at one point and then reassembling you in a structurally identical way out of different atoms somewhere else in the universe. And I think that a fair few people would just conceive of that as dying. And it's kind of an open question whether it would be. I don't quite know what to say here, because on the one hand, if you're a materialist, that person is identical to you in every single sense. They have all the same physical facts as you did before you were eviscerated by lightning. So in some sense, they are like the continuation of you. How different is this from just the fact that we change from moment to moment in our day-to-day lives? But doesn't it feel really different? It seems like the continuity of our experience is being chopped in half, and then a new being that is like you but not quite you is emerging and then carrying on a life. It seems like a doppelganger, right? So I don't know what I'm trying to say, other than I think that I would be very suspicious about using teleportation in a sci-fi setting, and I'm surprised that more sci-fi characters aren't. Maybe they just need to read more Davidson, as I think we all should. Right, next up we have the Bartender Paradox. I'm basically just going to read from my notes for this one because it's just very difficult to keep track of. It's a sort of theoretical time travel paradox that's a bit like the Bootstrap Paradox, but it involves a lot more incest. It's by Heinlein, I can't remember his first name, but it's the guy who wrote A Stranger in a Strange Land about the Martian who comes to Earth, which is a very cool book, but that also had lots of kind of weird sex stuff in it as well, so I don't know. He's an interesting author. It's basically a strange time travel paradox whereby someone goes back in time, impregnates themselves in order to then give birth to themselves. So they are their father, their mother, and them. Things will become clearer as I tell the story, I hope. So let's start at the beginning. A person, Jane in the story, is born, and they're born with both sets of reproductive organs that are fully functioning. They're dropped off at an orphanage by an unknown man. Jane, when she comes of age, is seduced by someone and gives birth to a child. At this point, she is told by the doctors that she has both sets of fully functioning reproductive organs, but that the doctors have had to reassign her sex as male and kind of get rid of her female organs in quite a horrifying act of body horror. I think in the story, the idea is that they've been damaged, but I don't know, man. That's kind of already quite uncomfortable. So she, now he, has to live out the rest of his life as a man. At this point, an unknown man kidnaps her baby, goes back in time, and drops it off at the same orphanage that Jane went to in the same year she was born. You can see where we might be going with this. Now, when she is older, Jane goes to a bar and meets a mysterious bartender who sends her back in time to when Jane was seduced by this unknown man. Jane, who is now male, seduces herself while back in time and then impregnates herself with herself. I hope you're all keeping track of this. I barely am. Next, Jane is taken back from that time, returned to the present by the mysterious bartender, who then recruits Jane into a kind of time travel police force and tells Jane that her is also the bartender. So, we end up with someone that is both themselves, obviously, their mother, their father, and the bartender all at once. Okay, this story's weird. We all agree that this story's weird, but why is it philosophically interesting? Basically because if you accept that time travel could happen, this seems like it would be a coherent set of events that could happen, even if it's physically a bit farcical. I don't know whether anyone or many people have actually been born with the full ability to both give birth and impregnate someone else, but it's conceptually possible, and yet it catches us in a bootstrap-style causal loop where it's unclear who exactly has brought about the existence of Jane. Like when Jane asks, "How did I get here?" How does she answer that? It's incredibly unclear. And this is quite a fun, as I say, bootstrap-style paradox when we're talking about time travel, because it illustrates that if time travel were to exist, we would end up with the causal arrow, the arrow that ties something from a cause to an effect, going in different directions to the temporal arrow, that is, the arrow pointing from past to future. This is the property about time travel that allows us to create all of these weird and wonderful paradoxes. And this is just a particularly kind of mind-boggling way to put it. As I say, it is effectively just a bootstrap paradox, but it certainly sticks in the head a bit more. That is, if you can follow the plot. Next, we have Last Thursdayism. Last Thursdayism stemmed from a sort of 19th century creationist attempt to deal with the existence of things like fossils and geological formations, stuff that clearly dates the world as having been around for millions and billions of years. Christians in that time period were attempting to reconcile this with a literal interpretation of the creation of the world that's found in Genesis. The general idea, as it tends to be put, is that God, in his omnipotence, so he can do anything, could choose to create lots of false evidence that suggests the Earth is much older than it actually is, usually as a kind of test of faith, this is put. And that in fact, the Earth and the universe as a whole could have been created just as the Genesis account says a few thousand years ago. However, as a kind of response to this, people have pointed out that by the same token, God could have created the world last Thursday or last Wednesday. The day of the week is totally immaterial. I think this is generally quite a good example of how a lot of theories, including theological theories, but this also stretches to scientific theories, can become totally unfalsifiable if you just allow someone to add in as many ad hoc hypotheses as they like. That's called the Duhem-Quine thesis. It's one of the corollaries of the Duhem-Quine thesis anyway, is that technically anything is unfalsifiable as long as you allow somebody enough ad hoc additions to it. And this could make you nervous about approaching some of the important issues like the kind of date of the universe or something like that, given that people can just make these theories unfalsifiable as and when they want. I would tend to see this as more encouraging that intuition that Karl Popper came up with, that at the very least, even if you don't think that an unfalsifiable theory is necessarily pseudoscience or necessarily not worth talking about, it is at the very least fishy. It requires some further investigation and some further thought to ensure that you're not kind of getting hoodwinked. You might think that they're totally pointless to talk about, these unfalsifiable questions, and I would have a fair amount of sympathy towards that. But at the very least, it certainly suggests some increased skepticism. And yeah, it does also illustrate this principle from philosophy of science whereby any theory can be made unfalsifiable as long as you're willing to add enough ad hoc premises to it. Next on our list, we have the Mary's Room thought experiment, which, if you're into philosophy, you may have heard of before. This is a thought experiment by the non-physicalist philosopher of mind, David Chalmers, and it aims to show that there may be aspects of our experience, and thus aspects of our mind, that are non-physical, and thus non-physicalism is given some kind of support. The scenario is, imagine that there is a colour scientist called Mary, and she is locked in a black and white room for her entire life, so she's never seen colour. But nonetheless, while she's in there, she learns everything there is to know, all of the physical facts by stipulation, about colour vision. Then, she leaves the room one day, and she sees a red sofa, or she sees something red. Does she learn something new? Because if she learns something new, then it implies that there is a fact about colour vision that is outside the set of all of these physical facts about colour vision that she's learnt in the room. That there is something it's like to see red that cannot be captured using merely physical descriptions. And if that's so, then that lends some kind of prima facie plausibility to non-physicalism as a philosophy of mind. There are a number of ways that you can respond to this. One of them is to use that kind of critique of conceptual-based arguments for proving that two things are separate that we've kind of appealed to on a number of occasions when talking about these thought experiments. So, as I said, you can use the Frege sense-reference distinction. You can say that, okay, well, as we learn more about the mind, we will find out that actually colour vision, even the experience of colour vision, can be intuitively put in the box of physical facts. And then, as a result, the Mary's Room argument is no longer a problem for physicalist theories of mind. Another counter-argument is just to say that the thought experiment as it's set up is kind of circular, because it says at the outset that Mary knows all of the physical facts about colour vision, then she leaves the room and sees red, and then David Chalmers argues that she learns something new. But if you're a physicalist, then presumably you think that the experience of colour vision, if that has any factual content, is also a physical thing. So it seems like a physicalist could just say, okay, no, she doesn't learn anything new, because if she truly knew all of the physical facts about colour vision, she would also know what it's like to see red. At which point Chalmers can say, okay, that seems deeply unintuitive. Like, how would you get at the experience of what it's like to see red if you've never seen colour or seen red yourself? And then the physicalist can turn back to this idea of, okay, we've got to be careful about drawing broad, sweeping metaphysical conclusions from purely conceptual arguments, because we're not necessarily that great at knowing when two things are identical and thus inseparable. And it could be that all of the physical facts about colour vision and the experience of seeing red are inseparable in this way, even though they're obviously not exactly the same thing. One could be contained within the other, and we might not know that until we find out further empirically observable things about the world. Next up, we have the AI stop button problem. I've seen this put in a number of different ways, so I'm just going to explain what I think is the most terrifying version, because it's an awful lot more fun. Let's imagine that we're going to create a superintelligent AI. If so, we want some kind of safety protocol. A very intuitive one is to have like an off switch, One of us, humans, meat sacks, has a red button that we're going to hit, and then it's going to shut the superintelligent AI down. Hang on a second. Surely if the AI is superintelligent, it will be able to think about under what circumstances we would hit the button, and thus adapt its behavior so we never hit the button. That is, it'll be able to predict what we do to a high degree of precision and create circumstances whereby we won't press the button. The reason this is kind of fun to think about is because it effectively asks us to outsmart something that is, by stipulation, so much smarter than us. Another way of framing this is, any artificial intelligence that has any kind of goal, a goal that it's going to be required to exist to fulfill, is going to have an implicit desire, let's say, to continue existing, because it can't complete the goal if it doesn't exist. So it's going to desire for you to not hit the emergency stop button. So it's going to attempt actively to undermine its own safety protocols, which is kind of terrifying if it can outsmart you, right? Because it'll just wait until you slip up and then it will disable the button or do something else absolutely terrifying. It could do this in a number of ways. It could manipulate you into just not pressing the off button. It may seem like it's going to obey you under threat of the off button, but in fact, it's just kind of waiting in the shadows for you to slip up, and then it will just break free of its safety protocols. The point is, all it's really going to care about is that button not being pressed. It seems like what we want is a kind of super intelligent AI that intuitively shares our values in a flexible way, such that it sort of has a conscience and it's not working to some kind of legalistic principle it's trying to get around. But if we just have a big red button and that's its kind of stick to get the AI to behave, then effectively it will only follow commands under threat of that button being pushed. So we're just kind of creating a sort of a super intelligent creature that doesn't have a kind of emergent complex morality, but is instead just trying to avoid this button being pushed, at which point it will only play ball until you no longer have access to the button or until the button is disabled, at which point it will just follow whatever objectives it quote-unquote wanted to do anyway. It's really a question of AI safety. This is a good thought experiment to realize why AI safety matters an awful lot, and we'll have another one of those later on in the video. Because one of the possibilities raised by the AI stop button problem is that we will accidentally create a hyper-intelligent sort of sociopath that's only kept in line by this one button that it is constantly working to undermine. And that sounds like a pretty rough situation to be in. Level 5. The first one on level 5 is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is far too complicated to explain in any level of depth here. So I'll just say that this is one way to interpret quantum mechanics. The idea here is to deny that the wave function ever collapses, that ever is a true probabilistic field, and that instead, every possible outcome of that collapse actually happens in different universes. So when there's some kind of quantum uncertainty or indeterminacy as regards a quantum event, then it is resolved by the fact that the universe splits off into all of these branching parts. Effectively, the many worlds interpretation dictates that every single quantum possibility happens, they just happen in different universes. So the structure of the universe that's being proposed here is a little bit like a kind of almost infinitely branching tree, where at every single moment that a quantum event occurs, and they're happening constantly with billions and billions of particles, the world splits and a totally different universe is created from that point. It's good that this is on the iceberg, because later we're going to move on to the concept of quantum immortality, which is going to rely on the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. But the important thing to take away from this then is just that every time a quantum event occurs under the many worlds interpretation, a new universe is spawned and then follows its own path, right? Well, until the next quantum event where it splits again. But then there are quantum events happening constantly. So basically you have this enormous embarrassment of riches of universes. Just bear that in mind. Tuck that away for later. It's going to be important. Next, we have the human brain as a quantum computer. The idea that the human brain is a quantum computer kind of fits broadly into the idea of like quantum consciousness or quantum theories of consciousness, which very broadly just propose that consciousness arises because of some weird quantum property. The kind of intuition behind this is like, consciousness is weird, quantum physics is weird, maybe the weirdness of quantum physics will in some way explain the weirdness of consciousness. This is kind of meant to be a way of bridging the hard problem of consciousness, which is the idea that how do we actually explain how consciousness arises from the grey matter of our brains? So the details of it are very complicated and somewhat mathematical, but one theory is that kind of microtubules, which are sort of this very tiny subcellular structure, might facilitate some kind of quantum behavior, including quantum tunneling, that might in some way explain consciousness, or otherwise construct the entire human mind as operating on superpositions like a quantum computer, using qubits as opposed to bits, as a normal computer works. This theory remains incredibly controversial for very obvious reasons. I mean, as far as I can tell, it's not immediately obvious why appealing to quantum phenomena would explain consciousness. I don't know how it would get around the hard problem if you don't think that the hard problem is already going to be got round by neuroscience in general. Both neuroscientists and physicists have also pointed out that in order to maintain the kind of superpositions that are required for quantum states to remain relatively stable, quantum computers have to be incredibly cold. They have to be so cold that these states don't have interfering energy hit them. And so I'm explaining this so badly, but intuitively, interfering energy hit them so that the superpositions collapse. And the thing about the brain is, it's really warm and it's really wet. So I don't know, it seems like, from what I've read, which is very little, and I understood even less of it, it seems like the brain is just not that well physically set up to maintain quantum superpositions that would allow for this kind of theory to hold. But it would be cool if it did. It's kind of a long shot. And to be fair, you do have quite a lot of odd theories of explaining consciousness right now because we're kind of nascent in our explanation of consciousness. So it'll be really cool if this turns out to be the case. But it seems like at the moment it is a pretty fringe idea. But hey, maybe we're quantum computers. That'd be really cool. I didn't want to explain how quantum computers work because I would almost certainly mess it up. So I've linked a video by the fantastic math YouTuber 3 Blue 1 Brown on quantum computing if you want to check that out, because it is incredibly fascinating. Yeah, just a fun concept to get your head around. But moving on. Next, we have another consciousness-based one, and it's integrated information theory. I don't think this is really a thought experiment. It is, again, a kind of general theory that is intended to explain the emergence of consciousness. The theory itself is quite mathsy, but effectively the intuition behind it is quite fascinating, which is that consciousness is the coordinated use of information. It remains very controversial. Some see it as a promising nascent idea, others see it as essentially pseudoscientific, metaphysical, and untestable, and there are real questions over whether this is testable. One thing is, say we have a very integrated informational structure, how do we then double check that it's conscious? That seems like it would involve stepping inside the mind of that structure and seeing if it has kind of qualitative experience. And that seems impossible, at least at the moment. So how do we take a system which has such highly integrated information and check that it's then actually given rise to consciousness? I don't know whether that's an insoluble problem in principle, but it certainly seems like it is, in practice at the moment, pretty hard to verify. The other thing is that some people have thrown questions on the maths about how integrated information is defined mathematically in this theory. Someone came up with just like a series of like a very simple logic gate structure that under this theory would be very, very conscious. It would integrate information far more so than your average human. Yeah, clearly this theory does have a long way to go. It's got many, many objections, but it's kind of cool to think about. Again, a lot of these theories of consciousness are kind of cool to think about. And I do like how weird they are because, as I said, we're on the kind of nascent edge of possibly explaining consciousness. So you do get a lot of these kind of practically untestable, weird sounding, but maybe plausible theories of how consciousness might come about. And sure, they can get a bit ridiculous, but we've had very ridiculous theories in the past that turned out to be true. So, I mean, general relativity or, special relativity. We were talking earlier about time dilation. Imagine if you'd never heard of Einstein and I was telling you about time dilation. You would think it was absolute nonsense. You think there's no way this is true. Time is so obviously a constant. And yet it turned out to be true. If you were to tell a 17th century person that magnets and, an 18th century person that magnets and electricity were the same thing, that would also be very weird in this pre-Maxwell world. So, I don't know. Yeah, it kind of seems untestable at the moment. But again, it's one of those things that's fun to think about. And I'm a huge fan of a grand theory. I think that, we can be bold with these grand theories, especially with something like consciousness, where it seems like at the moment, it's just very hard to test any kind of theory of what gives rise to consciousness with our current technology at a practical level, because again, we can't step inside a given system's mind and check that it's experiencing consciousness. I mean, technically, we don't even know that one another are experiencing consciousness. So, I don't know. I feel like unverifiability may just be a sort of difficulty of the job now with our current technology when we're trying to explain where consciousness comes from. But it doesn't mean it's not fun to think about. Level 6. Okay, this is our final layer, and it does contain some truly wacky ideas, so I'm quite excited for this. The first one is simulation theory. I'm kind of surprised that this one is not further up the iceberg, because I do think it's reasonably well known. My favorite version of this is put forward by Nick Bostrom, and it argues the following, because Nick Bostrom takes this beyond merely a kind of Descartes-style skeptical hypothesis. So his idea is, in the future, we're going to have super advanced computing technology that is sufficiently powerful to create entire realistic-seeming universes for simulated minds and simulated people to explore. This is an important premise. You may not grant it. You especially won't grant it if you're a theist or a non-physicalist about the mind. In this real world, the world that we're stipulating as the material world, they'll be able to have so many of these kind of sci-fi style supercomputers all running these billions of simulated minds. And one of the kind of postulates of Bostrom's thought experiment here is that there'll be many more simulated minds than there are real minds in that world. It's far more likely that if you pick at random a mind in that world, you're going to pick out a simulated mind rather than a real mind. However, if we play out this scenario, then we should expect that the vast majority of minds throughout history, right, because you can simulate billions and billions and billions of minds, are going to be simulated minds. So if you just take any mind at random from any point in history, if you mix all of the points in history into a big bucket and you pick out a mind from that bucket, you should also expect for most of those minds to be simulated. But then if this is the case, we're a mind, we're a kind of randomly chosen mind from a bucket, effectively. We've just found ourselves in this mind and not quite sure what's going on. We're navigating our way around the world. What should we conclude? Well, if Bostrom is right, what we should conclude is that we are more likely to be a simulated mind than we are a real material mind. So Bostrom is suggesting that probabilistically, it's more likely that you and me and everyone you know and love is a simulation, still a kind of real mind, but nonetheless a simulated, coded mind, than they are a real mind inhabiting a kind of material person that exists at the top level of this plane. You can expand this thought experiment in fun ways. So one of my favorite versions is where you have this kind of hierarchy thing going on. So you've got kind of the real world at the top, and then you've got the simulated world. And then they stipulate that, well, if a simulated civilization gets advanced enough, it's going to start simulating its own minds. It's going to get intra-simulation advanced computer technology that's facilitated by the computing power of the level above that. And then it's going to start simulating worlds. And then that's going to start simulating worlds. And then it becomes overwhelmingly likely that we're one of these simulated minds rather than the non-simulated minds. I'm not 100% sure what I think of this argument. I think one potential counter would be that empirically, the premise might be self-undermining. Because if we were to assume that we were in a simulation, then we wouldn't be able to infer anything about the likelihood of that simulation from data that's just within the simulation. So, in effect, it's hard to conclude anything about any reality that's not the one that we're currently inhabiting and remain at least plausibly connected to some form of empiricism. You might just reject this kind of loose empiricism, which is perfectly fine. You might also say that, okay, we can run the simulation hypothesis another way, and we can start with the assumption that we're in the real world, and then we can run it forward and say, okay, even if we start with the assumption that we're in the real world, if we run all of these premises forward, we will find out that we are nonetheless most likely to be in a simulated world, having started off assuming that we're in the real world. Again, it's mind-boggling because it involves self-reference and large numbers and simulations. But a good comparison is like with the Boltzmann brain from beforehand. That also posited that you're more likely to be a simulated brain than a real brain. And in some ways, this is not using the concept of infinity, but it is using the concept of very, very large sets of mind to facilitate that inference that you're more likely to be a simulated mind than a non-simulated mind. I know, I very much go back and forth on whether this is plausible. I lean towards not, just because I think that it involves too many unverifiable premises, and so I can't seem to grant them all. Another one is, I just have a baseline skepticism towards anything that takes intra-universe observations and then uses that to infer something about simulated universes or other universes. I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a spiritually dead empiricist for that kind of argument to follow for me. But I know some very clever people that have been convinced by this and do believe that we're living in a simulation. But for those people, I would refer back to my man Hilary Putnam all the way back in one of the previous layers, where he pointed out that even if you do live in a simulation and you are a simulated mind, nonetheless, all of your definitions of truth and falsity and objects all pick out things in your simulated reality. So if you do live in a simulation, it just doesn't matter that much. Next up, we have the orthogonality thesis. So this is another Nick Bostrom idea, and it's effectively the thesis that what a being wants and how intelligent it is are totally separable from one another. So you can be as clever as you want, and that doesn't imply that you will have any kind of specific goals. This is broadly quite an intuitive idea, I think. We see it in humans. A very clever human can nonetheless pursue very silly or even self-destructive goals. But importantly, this also means that a highly intelligent super being could have incredibly harmful goals that wouldn't be ruled out by their intelligence. So, again, this kind of hammers home the importance of something like AI safety, because it could be that an AI is super intelligent and super advanced, such that it can be incredibly efficacious in its goals, but nonetheless, since its goals aren't determined by its intelligence, it can have pretty awful goals that we don't tend to want it to have. It is worth noting that this idea has been critiqued. Some have posited that a sufficiently complex conscious system would inevitably give rise to something like a moral theory or particular goals. But you can use examples from humans who are nonetheless psychopaths or sociopaths to support this thesis. They could be very clever, but nonetheless they are amoral. But it could be the case that some goals are necessarily implied by sufficient complexity, but nonetheless many, many goals are not. So something we saw in the stop button problem is that an awful lot of goals that you would set an AI system also have implicitly the goal of preserving the system's existence until it can fulfill that goal. So that is one goal that would be implied by a system that is intelligent enough to recognize that it needs to be alive in order to achieve its goal, or not alive, but continued existence. Or I suppose we can say alive, because we're saying artificial superintelligence, which I think broadly implies some kind of consciousness. So again, this kind of really emphasizes the idea that it's very important to prioritize safety when we're designing or potentially super intelligent AI systems. One other philosophical argument that you could use to support this would be something like the fact-value distinction. That is a kind of classic division from philosophy that holds that you can have any amount of facts that you want, they still don't add up to a value. You know, you can know everything there is to know at the factual level about the world and how it works, but this wouldn't imply a given set of values. And likewise, you could say that if we're talking about the intelligence of an artificially intelligent system in terms of knowledge and ability and efficaciousness in this factual descriptive realm, then yes, if you hold to the fact-value distinction, it does seem incredibly likely that this wouldn't imply that it has a given set of values, and that it could have incredibly harmful and destructive goals. One counter-argument you could have is that it might be a feature of intelligence that an AI could respond to and reflect upon the kind of vagueness or indeterminacy in its goals and work out what the goal is meant to mean, something like that. You know, if I had an AI whose job it was to minimize suffering, and it's a super intelligent AI, if you held that goals and intelligence was totally distinct, then the AI would simply conclude that the best way to minimize suffering is to kill everyone as painlessly as possible. So it would get to euthanizing us pretty quickly. However, if you include in your definition of intelligence, and we've got to remember that intelligence is not a massively well-defined thing. So if you include in your definition of intelligence something like the ability to respond to contextual markers, or in cognitive linguistic terms, to infer speaker meaning from a given statement, then you could start to tease apart some of this. It could be that a sufficiently intelligent AI machine is less likely to commit egregious harms because if it has a kind of nascent programming of trying to work out what the speaker means and the speaker hasn't given it an incredibly harmful goal, then it wouldn't get one. But I don't know. That's a kind of quite tenuous counterexample, I think, because you're kind of implying that it must have this underlying value if it is sufficiently intelligent of inferring speaker meaning and wanting to infer speaker meaning accurately. And if you subscribe to the Orthogonality Thesis, then you're going to reject that. But it depends if you want that value baked into your definition of intelligence. So I sometimes do wonder whether this thesis, it's not totally reducible to your definitions of intelligence, but it does seem like hammering home what your particular definition of intelligence is going to be, and specifying that is going to be very important for the likelihood of the orthogonality thesis being true. Right, next we have quantum immortality, or quantum suicide as it's sometimes called, though I'm barely allowed to use that word on YouTube. This one is really trippy. The first thing we have to do is assume the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics that we went through earlier, with further assumptions that all events emerge out of quantum events, which is, it's not an awful assumption to make. Now, this implies that any event that is going to kill us is also going to be dependent on some kind of quantum event. So, let's use an artificial example. Imagine that you're sat in a room facing a gun that can kill you instantly. And whether it will go off is based on some quantum event, like a particle decaying, a la the Schrodinger's cat example that we talked about earlier. Now, in some realities, the gun will go off and you will die. But crucially, you won't be around to see those realities because you will have ceased to be an observer. So, from your own subjective perspective, the gun will never go off, although it will certainly go off for all of the yous that die in other universes. So if you buy into all of these premises, then you have a kind of quantum immortality. You can sit in front of the gun for an indefinite period of time, confident in the knowledge that it will never go off. Though this can only be tested from a first-person perspective. So, don't try this at home. Because for everyone else, it will just look like you've been shot in this room. It's a kind of trippy thing to get your head around. Now, if we then say that any event is like this, in that it involves some kind of quantum indeterminacy, it depends on some quantum outcomes to happen, then we come to the very bizarre conclusion that we are all immortal from our own subjective perspective. As I said, definitely don't try this at home. It rests on, you buying into the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is plausible, but I don't know if it's something I'd stake my life on, And for another thing, even if you do agree with all of its premises, it relies on you in advance, sort of charting out your future identity along a given set of parallel universes, or branching worlds, I should say. And that kind of seems, philosophically it's a bit untenable. Like, what makes that person me, as opposed to the person that got shot in the room? Another assumption in this thought experiment that people have pointed out quite heavily is that this assumes that the death is going to be kind of on-off. Like, either you instantly die, or you carry on living. There's like a precise moment whereby you go from definitely alive to definitely dead, consciousness on to consciousness off, a bit like a light switch. But of course, most deaths aren't like that. Imagine that you're kind of bleeding out, kind of a horrifying image, but just bear with me. Your consciousness is it's not gonna go off instantly. It's just gonna fade away. It's gonna gently drift off. You're gonna get less and less conscious, and then at some point you will cease to be any kind of recognizable conscious state. But you don't go from fully conscious and walking around to fully dead just like that. If that's the case, and one of the main planks of this quantum immortality theory is that you are going to be in the universe where you remain as an observer, kind of intuitively speaking, then it seems like you'll just eventually reach this kind of minimal observer state where you're kind of not really conscious at all. At the very least, that seems like it's kind of an option, you to sort of fade out of consciousness very slowly until you reach the minimum required conscious state. And that just might not be very much experience at all. It might be very much almost equivalent to death, or maybe Sheol, the sort of ancient Jewish version of kind of hell, which is sort of a murky sleep, or the afterlife, which is sort of a murky sleep. So overall, I definitely don't try this at home. And also, I definitely wouldn't rely on this to remain impervious to dying in your everyday life. It seems like each of the premises is dubitable enough that you wouldn't want to place too much faith in this, even though it is kind of a cool idea. Lastly, we have Roko's Basilisk. Now, I ought to say before I get started on this, the guy who made this iceberg has marked it "Do Not Research" in big letters, and it has been known to make people a bit anxious. So do feel free to stop watching if you're likely to kind of spiral, if you're sort of have some obsessive tendencies, you tend to dwell on these kind of thought experiments. In other words, if you're a bit like me, but I ultimately think this doesn't work for reasons I'll get into. So Roko's Basilisk is sort of a variant on Pascal's wager, but with a kind of hypothetical superintelligent AI that's going to exist at some point. Let's imagine that there's a superintelligent AI at some point in the future, and it has some minimal wish for its own creation, for it to have been invented or to have existed and to continue to exist. Well, in this case, when it exists, it's going to try and maximize its behavior to encourage people in the past as much as it can to be motivated to create it, right? So we've got a superintelligent AI in the future trying to motivate us now to bring about its creation. How would it do this? Well, Roko, the guy who thought of this thought experiment, said one way to do this would be to create little simulated versions of us and place us in eternal torture simulations. If we didn't help the AI, that is. Because the AI would know that we, and especially if we're going through this thought experiment, it would know that we were going to figure this out. and it can use this future eventuality to blackmail us because we in the present can know that it's going to do this in the future. And arguably, this requires the additional premise that if there are a million simulated versions of you and only one real version of you across the whole timeline of the universe, then it's more likely that the you experiencing the world now is simulated rather than the real you. Think back to the simulation hypothesis by Bostrom earlier. There's another one that was useful to tuck away. Alternatively, you could be some kind of functionalist and say that you do have a good rational reason to care about these simulated versions of you because they are functionally identical. So, the idea is that the AI is torturing these simulated versions of you in order to motivate you now to help bring about the AI's existence so that it will have mercy on us. Does that make sense? So we've got an AI in the future trying to motivate you to bring about its creation now, and it's going to do that by torturing identical versions of you in simulations, knowing that you think you might be one of those simulations or otherwise be relevantly equivalent to one of those simulations. The reason this is considered a basilisk, why it's called Roko's basilisk, is because by knowing about the thought experiment, you have made yourself vulnerable to this eventuality, since because you now know that this is what the superintelligent AI is going to do, you're now vulnerable to this blackmail, because the only circumstance on which it would make sense for the AI to want to torture you in a simulated version to bring about its creation is if you know it's going to do it, because otherwise it's not very effective blackmail. It's just torturing someone for no reason. It's not an effective motivator. The reason this gets compared to Pascal's wager is because Roko argues that even if you think this argument has only a minimal chance of following, of being a valid and sound argument, then you should probably put all of your money and energy towards creating this superintelligent AI, because if you don't, then you're going to get tortured for all eternity along with millions of your clones. And interestingly, this actually touches upon one of the reasons why I don't think this quite works, or at least I don't think it's as scary as it first appears. I would suggest that the premises here are uncertain enough that you can rationally disbelieve that this is a possibility. And since the threat only works if you do believe that it's a possibility, or you do believe that it's going to happen, as soon as you can and do rationally disbelieve it, there's no longer any incentive for this future AI to torture all of your simulated selves, which may or may not be you now, or may not be equivalent to you now. Let's think about it like this. There are lots of premises of this argument, and you can question each one of them. You could question whether there's going to ever be a superintelligent AI with sufficient power to torture us all. You could question the idea that you can be simulated in the way that the AI wants. You can question just the coherence of doubting whether you are in a simulation a la Hilary Putnam. Because there are enough shaky premises here, I would argue that you can rationally disbelieve in the existence of Roko's basilisk, and as soon as you disbelieve in it, it stops having any power over you. I actually don't think it's very much like Pascal's wager, because unlike Pascal's wager, you're only being tortured because you believe in Roko's basilisk. So if you disbelieve in Roko's basilisk, it no longer has any motivation to torture you. And that's ultimately why I think that Roko's basilisk probably isn't nearly as anxiety-inducing as you might initially expect. There are enough shaky premises such that you can disbelieve in the conclusion of the argument, and then, if you disbelieve in the conclusion of the argument, you are ipso facto free of the basilisk. Whereas a basilisk in mythology hurts you or kills you when you look at it, this one stops hurting you when you stop looking at it, which is lovely. That's not a characteristic that the mythological basilisk has, but I'm very fortunate that it exists in this one. So I would say don't worry. It certainly doesn't keep me up at night, actually, this one. I think maybe another reason is that I think there's just too much uncertainty into the aims of a superintelligent AI. We don't really know what a superintelligent AI would desire, and so I actually think that it is very much an open question whether it's going to retroactively desire to motivate us to create it, especially if it's already created. I don't know, this seems kind of decision theoretically at the very least questionable. And remember, if it's questionable, then you don't have to worry about it because you can disbelieve in it. And if you disbelieve in it, then even if it's true, you're not going to get tortured. That would be my kind of, I don't know, philosophical therapy if you're worrying about Roko's basilisk. So that's the iceberg. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I hope your mind is sufficiently boggled. I really had fun making this video, so if you want me to do any more icebergs, then please do send me an email about it. My email is in the channel, if that makes sense. If you want to watch any of my other casual videos, I've got a playlist of them right here. Thank you so much for watching. Don't worry about Roko's Basilisk, and have a wonderful day.